Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host, Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. This is the 6th episode of the Son of the North podcast. If you enjoy today's show, make sure to follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, BitChute, and other platforms where podcasts can be found. If you're looking for more great Son of the North content, make sure to follow me, Rex, on Instagram at Son of Dyēus. Now, let's not waste any more time and get into today's show. Enjoy!
Ufanele abelafa, nadaw. Tola Ariana, beyisi kima esa fila.
Ja.
Wam tola, ubelakala ukibela amahashi. Nagamuva kwake.
Come on! Yeah! Whoa now, boy. Whoa. Ah, welcome, friend. Come, have a seat around my fire. Night on the steppe is cold, but the stew in my pot is warm. Help yourself to a bowl. It seems like you've been having quite the difficult night. My, you have quite the appetite, friend. Surely it could rival that of the striker himself. Quite fitting for one who wears the attire of a kshatriya. What's the matter? There's no need to be shy. It has been quite a long time since I've had such an interesting guest around my fire. I'm quite the wanderer, you see. My journey thus far has brought me through many a land, across desert, steppe, and taiga, and now to you. The gods have tasked me with this nomadic existence. I am fated to wander, spreading the stories of our ancestors among our people, at campfires much like this one. Ah, it seems that Perkwunos wards over us tonight. Truly this is a blessing, for the tumultuous crashing of his mace will frighten away the adversaries from our camp. You see, my fellow wanderer, the booming of thunder has always struck fear into the hearts of the adversaries, for it reminds them of their greatest humiliation, their defeat at the hands of Deus Pater and his unconquerable son, Sol. Yes, who could forget that great war so long ago? The war to decide who would rule over our world. What? You've not heard this tale before. I see. So you are from the lands of the new conquests. To think that it was only a few generations ago that some of our Hieros first thundered out from the steppes. To think how much of our traditions have been lost in that time. Fear not, my friend, for I shall tell you this story. I shall tell you it as it was relayed to me by the most ancient and luminous of the bards. Now, where to start? There are many stories from the beginning, prior to the first age of gods and men. This is but one. You see, my friend, the events that I'm about to retell to you took place long, long ago, long before the existence of our world and all others. In this time and place, trapped between existence and non-existence, there was Gin, the great yawning void. In this age of chaos, Earth was nowhere, nor heaven above. There was no field, nor was there forest, nor mountain there was. There was no sea with turbulent wave, nor was there wind-blown steppe. The sun did not shine, nor did the moon glow with pale beauty, nor was there the twinkle of a single star. When there was not, Gain was. From deep within the void of Gain poured out two primordial energies, heat and cold. These two energies were dynamic opposites, and yet it was their convergence that birthed the cosmos. Deep within Gain, the flow of heat and cold met and swirled together. From the meeting of these two energies was born the great cosmic egg, the ovum from which all of the universe would emerge. After the passing of many cosmic days and nights, which to us mere mortals would seem like an eternity, the cosmic egg burst open in an instant. Out from the crack in the egg poured a deluge of fatty and nutritious cosmic milk. This milk was in fact referred to by our ancestors in the last Kali Yuga as the Milky Way. This milk burst forth and flooded throughout Gain. It is this ocean of milk that largely sustains the gods in the heavens. But my friend, this sea is not the focus of our story here tonight. For you see, with the hatching of the cosmic egg, the first of the gods arose. From one half of the eggshell, which happened to rest in the flowing heat, arose Dyēus, fully formed in all of his glory. His skin was pale like milk, his body and muscles firm and perfect. His long locks of dark hair bounced off his strong shoulders, with strands of beautiful silver interspersed throughout his beard and hair. His glowing eyes radiated a pure and beautiful white light, which warmed and illuminated the darkness of the void. From the other half of the eggshell, which had sunk into the flowing cold, arose Dheghom. Like Dyēus, she too was born fully formed. Dheghom was a beauty without compare, the very embodiment of divine femininity. Her complexion was a beautiful earthen tone, and the tough, shining strands of her golden hair playfully rested around her plump curves. She cast a sharp, cold gaze across the cosmos. Now, I'm sure, my friend, that you know Dyēus and Dheghom, in whichever form they manifest themselves to you in the colonies. But you see, my friend, at their birth, Dyēus and Dheghom had yet to assume their role within the larger cosmic picture. While Dyēus and Dheghom had arisen, they had yet to become the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. These two deities, destined to be partners in the divine pairing, at first were repulsed by their opposite natures. Dyēus was proud and radiated an overpowering aura of warmth, whereas Dheghom sat cold and distant from her husband-to-be. The two deities paid little attention to each other at first, instead preoccupied by the crashing white primordial sea in front of them. Like babes drinking from the teat of their mother, each of the young gods took a large drink from the cosmic sea of milk and found nourishment and strength. Over the course of many cosmic days and nights, the two gods drank up from the sea of primordial milk until it was but a fraction of its original volume. My friend, I can see upon your face that you have been through much conflict in your life. I'm sure you know of what I speak, but for the sake of our story tonight, I must impart you with this maxim regardless. As is the nature of this world, conflict is bound to arise between two peoples when the resources they share become scarce. The same principle applies to the gods themselves. Dyēus and Dheghom knew that they would eventually have to fight over what little remained of the primordial sustenance they so relied upon. To prepare for the coming battle, Dheghom sought to create for herself an army of loyal soldiers. With her growth, she had come to recognize the true potential of the divine feminine spark that lay within her, the ability to create life. Whilst Dyēus was preoccupied, the goddess retreated within Gain and drank in the void itself. For 9 long cosmic months, Dheghom writhed in pain, crying out in agony. But the cold goddess was set on her task, and could now feel new life swell within her body. She had yet to realize, however, that life created without the contribution of both the male and female spark was imperfect, destined to be nothing but abomination. After those seemingly never-ending months of pain, Dheghom went into labor. The first being to slither out of her divine womanhood was Ngui, the great and powerful three-headed serpent. The great goddess gave birth to 999 other cosmic beings, each crawling forth bearing a horrific, monstrous appearance. These abominations would, in time, become the great enemies of the gods, the beings referred to by our ancestors as the Adversaries. When all was said and done, Dheghom looked over her ugly new children with pride. She finally had the army she sought, and was prepared to wage war with Dyēus over what remained of the primordial cosmic sea. During all this time that Dheghom spent in pregnancy and in labor, the god that was to become the Sky Father drank not from the cosmic sea, but instead looked inward in meditation. After those long 9 cosmic months, he found within himself an understanding of his true divine nature. He knew that, as an embodiment of the divine masculine, a manifestation of the warmth of Gain, he lacked the ability to create life within himself. However, with his newfound wisdom, he recognized that even the greatest of warriors can be overwhelmed and defeated by his enemies if he fights alone. As Dheghom and the army of her children crossed the void, Dyēus again took a meditative pose, seeking an answer for the dilemma now facing him. With each deep breath, he could feel the primordial masculine warmth surge throughout his every organ. His heart, his lungs, his genitals, his eyes. The answer he sought came in an instant, like the thundering bolts he would eventually come to throw. Victory required sacrifice. At once, Dyēus knew what he had to do to secure victory in the battle to come. The meditating god slowly reached up towards his right eye and, with great speed and precision, plucked the luminous orb from his skull. Dyēus cried out in pain, a roar that echoed throughout the cosmos, and spoke aloud these words.
Victory cannot be achieved without sacrifice. I, firstborn among the gods, offer my right eye as sacrifice. May I find triumph in the battle to come.
The great god then opened his palm and dropped the plucked eye into the flowing heat of Gain. The eye traveled along until it came to the point within Gain where heat and cold met and swirled together. A rumbling sounded from within the vortex, and the torrent spat out into the cosmos an overpowering radius that pierced the darkness of the void. As the light rose upward, the adversaries were forced to shield their eyes. They cried out in pain. The effulgence of the rising star burnt their cold raw skin and blinded them. This, my friend, was the birth of Sol, the great lord of light, piercer of the darkness, bane of the adversaries, and eye of the Sky Father. The being descended and knelt before his father in humble obeisance. With the divine blood still leaking out of his open wound, Dyēus bore a wide, toothy grin. The Sky Father let out a deep, bellowing laugh, which again rumbled the cosmos. Now the stage was set for the great war to come, the Kosmogonamachy. Dyēus and Sol, who was his son and an extension of himself, were to face off with Dheghom and her massive army of her tormented children. Eager to show off his martial prowess to his father, Sol offered to fight and vanquish all 1,000 of Dheghom's children by himself. He recognized, after all, that the root of the war lied in his father's conflict with Dheghom. Dyēus accepted his offer, but would not send his son into battle unarmed. He took one of the fine silver strands of his hair within his fingers and plucked it out from his scalp, shaping it into Sol's divine bow. From a piece of the cosmic eggshell, Dyēus fashioned Prothos, Sol's unbreakable celestial chariot. With his new weapons in hand, Sol rode out to face the adversaries. The wheels of his chariot were pulled by divine horses manifested from the sun god's very own radiance. The adversaries prepared to face the incoming rider, bearing gnarled tooth, claw, fang, and crude weapons of war. As the chariot neared its collision with the prepared ranks of the enemy, Sol revealed his true divinity in a blinding flash of light. The front ranks of the adversaries, now blinded, were unable to hold their formation. Sol's chariot crashed into the adversaries, with many of their deformed bodies being crushed and mangled underneath his wheels. From his divine bow, he fired off arrows of pure light, manifesting from his radiance, which pierced the heart of his enemies. Reflecting their unnoble and coward nature, most of the adversaries broke rank and began to flee from the conquering sun. "Run!" they cried in panic. "The enemy before us is unconquerable." Unwavering from his duty, the sun god chased down the retreating enemies and did his best to smite as many of the abominations as he could. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the battlefield, Dyēus and Dheghom prepared to meet in hand-to-hand combat. The two approached and locked fingers and began to wrestle in a desperate struggle. The cosmos shook violently with each moment. It was a brutal battle, with hair and beard being pulled, tooth and nail gouging into the flesh of the enemy, and blow after brutal blow bruising otherwise flawless divine skin. While the struggle seemed to be an even match to onlookers, Dheghom recognized that Dyēus' time spent in meditation provided him with a mental edge in the battle. In time, Dyēus managed to take hold of Dheghom and violently tossed her onto her back. Frustrated and in pain, the Earth Mother let out all of her violent rage in a loud, booming roar. While Dyēus moved to pin her and force her into submission, Dheghom carefully wrapped her legs around the god so as to keep her distance and, in a move of desperation, began to birth more abominations from within. The monsters crawled out one by one, biting at Dyēus' ankles and moving to join the main force that was engaging Sol. Dyēus cried out in pain and slammed his fists down upon the newly birthed enemies. Angered at his enemy's new tactic, Dyēus inserted his phallus into Dheghom to plug her up and prevent the birth of new adversaries. Sol fought on without breaking a sweat, each of his heavenly bolts meeting its mark and bringing down another enemy. Dyēus and Dheghom continued wrestling, with their struggle becoming more wild and ecstatic with each moment. The two enemies locked eyes in their violent embrace, each secretly admiring the strength and tenacity of their opponent. While the two sweated and panted with exhaustion, they simultaneously were enjoying the clashing of their interlocked bodies. The cosmos continued to shake as the two struggled, and Dyēus could feel a warm pressure building up within him. In an instant, the pleasure and pressure overwhelmed Dyēus and was released. A bright and loud flash crashed through the heavens and fell upon Dheghom's flesh. At the moment that the lightning bolt struck Dheghom, the striker, Perkwunos, was born, and immediately he leapt towards the adversaries, his trusted club in hand, ready to crush the serpents with blow after thunderous blow. Afterwards, the first drops of rain emerged from the Skyfather and fell upon the earth herself, fertilizing her cold depths. By a fated accident, the union of the primordial energies was made manifest in physical form. Dheghom was impregnated with true, undeformed life. The sacred union, Hieros Gamos, had been realized. Dheghom felt a pressure pushing outward from within, and clenched her eyes shut, crying out in pain. She tightly gripped Dyēus' hand, not in anger, but as a seeming cry for support. Startled by the events that had transpired, Dyēus removed his lingam from within Dheghom and stood at the Earth Mother's side. Sol and the adversaries stopped in the midst of battle, all of their eyes locked on the miracle that was occurring. To ease her discomfort, Dyēus lifted up Dheghom and carried her to the primordial sea of milk, lowering her into the soothing embrace of the liquid. After a short while, twin female divinities sprung forth from Dheghom's womb. The first to be born was Gova Meter, the cattle mother. Second to be born was Aursa Meter, the bear mother. As twin embodiments of motherhood, the two goddesses emerged and immediately began to assist Dheghom as she continued to give birth. For this, these two are the goddesses of midwifery and should always be invoked during childbirth. With another push, a pair of twin male divinities were born. These two divinities were the Equos, the divine horse twins. For a moment, Dheghom's painful labor had subsided. Using all of his strength, Dyēus helped the new mother to her feet. With the Hieros Gamos, the union of the male and female divine sparks, being realized, Dyēus and Dheghom understood that they were more than just opposites. They realized that they were the physical manifestations of the primordial energies, and that their sacred union was the physical balancing of these two energies. Dyēus and Dheghom had taken on their true forms, Pater and Meter. Looking outward with motherly love at her new, whole, and perfectly divine children, Dheghom Meter called out to the adversaries to stop their fighting. Looking at her new partner Dyēus with love and admiration, Dheghom Meter decreed that the war was now over. The gods had found a compromise. Skyfather and Earth Mother shall together rule over the primordial sea, and all worlds to be created within it, as king and queen. But, as we who live on this imperfect mortal plane know, the adversaries never know when to give up. The adversaries could not accept their mother's decree. for their hearts were full of jealousy and hatred. With their bodies so horribly deformed and flawed, how could the adversaries coexist alongside such beautiful and perfect new divinities? Were they not Dheghom's firstborn? Why then did she not favor them over her newer children? Furthermore, how could the adversaries bend the knee and swear fealty to the wretched Dyēus and his son who had so thoroughly chastised and humiliated them on the battlefield? The hatred and envy within the hearts of the adversaries grew and grew, and their horrible forms took on a darker countenance. The adversaries rejected their mother's peace, and, led by Ungvi the firstborn, they sought to betray their mother and secure power for themselves. Dheghom's labor was not yet finished, and again Dyēus laid his queen within the soothing sea of milk. With envy and contempt filling their hearts, the adversaries swarmed towards their weakened mother in an attempt to slay the great goddess. With Sol and the striker by his side, Dyēus and his sons began to smite the adversaries with great fury and vigor. In panic and fear, the remaining adversaries fled and hid themselves within the darkness of Gain. The great gods would have hunted down and slain every last adversary had Bovameter and Orsameter not needed their aid in delivering the final baby. With one final push, a great and blinding radiance emerged from Dheghom-meter's yoni. The twin animal goddesses of midwifery held in their hands a female baby with a golden and unblemished countenance. Within the baby's effulgence, they could see every color of the rainbow, and not one of the gods present was not moved to tears in awe of the sight. Hausos, the golden goddess of the radiant dawn, was born. Over the course of a cosmic fortnight, Dheghom recovered, and the Skyfather and the Earth Mother set about creating a new world on which their children could live and thrive. Dheghom-meter took a firm stance and manifested her raw divinity as the physical earth upon which you and I will live and die. Next, Dyēus Pater took up his seat in the heavens and projected his raw divinity, forming the skies which surround and protect the earth against the dark void that surrounds it. To protect the new world, Sol began circling the planet in his great celestial chariot, his radiant effulgence scouring the ball of mud, grass, and stone in search of surviving adversaries. His arrival heralded by the young goddess Hausos. But let me tell you, my friend, Dyēus's eye cannot illuminate every nook and cranny of the earth. Working their way through the shadows, the adversaries returned to their mother and slithered deep within her pores until the light of Sol could no longer reach and sting them. Here, in the dark, dank depths of the Earth Mother, the angry and jealous deities plotted their revenge. They surely could not match the raw strength and martial prowess of Dyēus and his sons, so they had to resort to their own greatest strengths, their cunning and their intrigue. Led by the great three-headed serpent Ungvi, the adversaries conspired from the shadows, biding their time until a new opportunity for revenge presented itself. They thought that, perhaps, their dark and poisonous touch could someday corrupt some element of creation and turn the tide. Unfortunately, my friend, as fate would have it, in time an opportunity would present itself. For you see, two more beings had arisen from the depths of Gain, twin titans. Their names were Manu and Yemo. But this is a story for another day. Haha, you seem quite entranced, my friend. I'm glad you've enjoyed this most ancient story. Alas, it will be the last story that I share with you this night. I feel the gods calling to me, and the winds of fate blow in my sails. I must venture onward, but I embark, leaving you with this story and the warmth of my fire. Keep them both close to you, for they will provide much comfort in difficult nights such as these. I hope to see you again someday, friend, but until then, I must say goodbye. May the gods bless you and watch over you in the years to come. Hello again, friends. Welcome back to the regular section of the Son of the North podcast. I really hope you enjoyed that story. I know a lot of you had been asking me to go over some more Indo-European mythology, so I'm happy to explore this very important myth. Now, before we go any further with commentary on this story, I want to talk a little bit about the word myth itself. In the Kali Yuga, the modern world, we have a tendency to believe that if something is a myth, that it's a total fabrication, or at least that's the meaning that the word has taken on in this time. However, when I refer to some of our ancestral stories as myths, I'm not saying that they're fiction. In fact, quite far from it. When I refer to these stories as myths, I am essentially stating that they take place in what can be referred to as mythic time, a time before recorded human history. By reciting these myths in a ritualized context, like sitting around a fire with friends, for example, the storyteller is essentially inviting all who are listening to become participants in the story. They are invoking an eternal return to this mythic time, to the time before recorded human history. In terms of Indo-European myths, this is perhaps one of the most important myths, as it explains the origin of the cosmos, the main pantheon of gods, and of our world itself. If you haven't heard this full story before, I wouldn't blame you, because as it exists, this myth is not recorded in any scholarly text about Indo-European religion. Certainly, scholars have been able to reconstruct some elements of this myth through the use of comparative mythology. For example, we know that many Indo-European traditions saw that the before times, before anything existed, there was only a sort of void or chasm. We see this in the late Indo-European text, the Rig Veda, but we also see this mention of a primordial void in the Greco-Roman traditions, where it is referred to as chasm. If you are familiar with or a practitioner of Germanic and Norse Indo-European traditions, then you will see in this story quite striking similarities with the concept of the Gnunga gap, the yawning void. Indeed, on an etymological level, this association with yawning seems to be an important part of the original Indo-European myth. This is where the word gen comes from, which is the Indo-European root for to yawn or to stretch. So clearly, some elements of this original cosmogony myth are well known to scholars and practitioners of the various Indo-European traditions alike. But the whole story as it exists, as I have retold it to you today, is a brand new revelation. Now, you may be wondering, friends, Rex, how did you fill in the blanks of this lost myth? I am happy to say that where academic reconstruction fails to provide us the whole picture, the gods provide. For you see, my friends, I only came to know this ancient myth in its full primordial form only quite recently. From my various studies of the different branches of the Indo-European tree, I knew the trace elements of this story, but the filler in the middle was lost, as it is lost to history. As is the case for any living religious tradition, the origin myth and the understanding of how our world came to be is a crucial element in how the practitioners of any religion shape their worldview. As a person who wants to play a role in the greater tribal revival that we are witnessing in the Kali Yuga today, it was quite distressing to me that we, as practitioners of Indo-European traditions, could not access this original myth. And so, where academia fails, I once again turned to the gods. A couple Sundays ago, I found myself making ritual offerings to Dyēus and to Sol Invictus. While I laid out my sacrifice, in the back of my mind bounced around thoughts of why this ancient story, one that was so fundamental in shaping the worldview of our ancestors, had been lost to the ravages of time. I had been attempting to reconstruct the myth by looking at the various different sources of Indo-European cosmogony, but ultimately, all of my attempts were in vain. I struggled to fill in the blanks and I couldn't figure out the bigger picture. Frustrated with my lack of progress, I decided that a more important religious ritual would be necessary if I was to find the answers I sought. I drove out north of my town and headed towards the hills. I decided that I would need to dedicate a new shrine to Dyēus if I was to receive his favor and potentially unravel this mystery. If you follow me on Instagram, then you will have seen the picture of the shrine that I constructed in that beautiful natural setting. Regardless, after I'd finished constructing my shrine, I decided to meditate on my thoughts for a little bit. I pulled out my jaw harp and began playing. As I was playing my jaw harp, 3 ravens flew overhead, a very auspicious sign. Clearly, the gods were watching me that day. I continued my meditation, and after a while, I felt a warm pressure build up within my chest, the same pressure that I've always felt when having a religious experience. I continued my meditation, and almost like a lightning bolt striking me, I suddenly had a very powerful revelation, no doubt delivered by the gods themselves. This story, in the very form I have retold to you today, suddenly appeared in my head as if I had always known it. It was a very bizarre experience, and I immediately realized that I could not afford to forget such valuable sacred knowledge. I immediately started heading down the trail and rushed home so that I could write it down and now recount it to you, my beloved followers. Now, some of the skeptics among you might think this sounds a little bit insane, but, as we know from our ancient texts, in the time of the Kali Yuga, the sane will be considered insane, and the insane will be considered the norm. I am not demanding that you believe my story about this experience, but I hope that you can look at this myth as it is, as I have portrayed it to you, and I hope that it can provide you some value in your own personal religious practice. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, I think we can move on to some commentary I have on the myth. While within this story we can see many parallels to other Indo-European cosmogony myths, clearly the closest parallel is the Norse version of the story of Ginnungagap. In both Gain and Ginnungagap, we see that there is a flowing of heat and cold in the void. This flowing ultimately merges at some lower point and creates a vortex from which the creation of the cosmos emerges. It seems that the merging of these two primordial energies was an essential force in the creation of the universe. We should thus see cold and heat as two sides of the picture of the creative potential of the universe. Only together can creation be achieved. With the emergence of Dyēus from the flowing heat of Gain, and the emergence of Dheghom from the flowing cold of Gain, we see that these two primordial energies are also associated with the biological sexes. Heat being associated with the masculine, and cold being associated with the feminine. Now, I am not a scientist, but obviously women have the potential to be warm and men have the potential to be cold. I think this myth is trying to hint at something on a deeper metaphysical level, and not so much the physical reflections of heat and cold that we feel in our world. Sometimes in English, when a person dies, we say that they are returned to the cold grasp of the earth. This is particularly interesting considering the Earth Mother's association with the element of cold on a primordial level. We also know that on an objective level, Mother Nature can sometimes seem quite cold and apathetic, and so her characterization as cold and apathetic within the myth seems quite appropriate. Of course, Dyēus is associated with heat. This is pretty reasonable considering that both the sun and lightning, which are emanations of Dyēus, are very, very hot. To the uninitiated, cold and heat seem to be opposite energies, but in fact they are two sides of the same coin. Now, if you are quite familiar with Oriental traditions, this is an obvious parallel, and we see it in the model of the yin-yang. The yin-yang also represents the balancing of male and female energies among a host of other opposites. Surely, while our tribes may differ, we can all attempt to arrive at the same grand cosmological truth. The origins of the universe in a grand cosmological egg is something that is attested to in Dumézil, so the fact that it appeared in the myth the gods revealed to me was quite assuring of its authenticity. The only parallel I could find for a cosmic sea of milk is within Hindu traditions. That being said though, as our ancestors originated from the steppe, a land where crops could not be grown and animal products, particularly milk, were such an important staple of their diet, it makes sense to imagine the world as being nurtured by a cosmic milk. Of course, in ancient times, the night sky would have been much clearer, so as our ancestors sat out and looked up at the sky, they would have seen the swirling of white and yellow that pervades the cosmos. To them, it would make total sense to imagine this as milk. We do refer to it as the Milky Way in English, after all. Perhaps this cosmic milk that the gods are drinking in this myth is a parallel for the ambrosia that the Greek gods consume, or the amrita that the Hindu gods consume. A sort of divine food that has celestial origins and assures the immortality of the deities. The conflict between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother is not attested to in many Indo-European traditions, but in some myths, hints of it can be found. In particular, one can think of the Greek myth involving Zeus fighting off the great serpent monster Typhon, which was produced by the Earth Mother Gaia. In Hindu traditions, Indra fights off a great serpent, Vritra, who tries to steal water from the world. While Vritra, the great serpent, does not necessarily originate from the Hindu Earth Mother, we do know that Vritra is associated with fighting the sun as well. Interesting, given that Sol is one of the main mythical enemies of the Adversaries. Both Typhon and Vritra seem to be fitting parallels of Ngui, the firstborn of Dheghom Mater's abominations, and, by virtue of birthright, the most powerful and often considered to be the leader of the Adversaries. Throughout Indo-European traditions, the enemies of the gods are often represented as serpents and are often associated with chthonic origins. In Hinduism, for example, we have the Naga, who are a subterranean race of serpentine people, although the Naga do not always have a predisposition for evil and mischief. I think the important takeaway here is that the adversaries are not always necessarily serpents, but that, like serpents, they are prone to dwelling in the deep and dark and humid places within the earth. I don't think this necessarily represents an ancestral fear of caves, caverns, and other subterranean dwellings, but for people who worshipped the sky, it would seem that the gods would have a natural opposition to subterranean features within the earth. Now, when we consider the possibility that the adversaries, being the jealous and spiteful gods they were, could have possibly traveled elsewhere and preached to other tribes of people that they were the main gods, one can imagine that it is possible that the adversaries were represented in the pantheons of non-Indo-European traditions. From my own research, I have concluded that these cults around the adversaries seem to have mostly sprung up in the Middle East and North Africa, in particular among Phoenician culture. For example, recent archaeological excavations at the ancient Phoenician city of Carthage have revealed underground cults associated with child sacrifice to the main Carthaginian gods, particularly one known as Tanit. In the Old Testament of the Bible, which itself is a pretty good source of ancient knowledge on Near Eastern religious traditions, we find that Yahweh is often telling the tribes of Israel to avoid falling back into child sacrifice. This implies that at some point in the past, their Near Eastern ancestors were performing child sacrifice on the regular. Also littered throughout the Bible are references to Moloch and other gods who are offered children as a sacrifice in fiery rituals. When we look at the contents of the story I told you today, it would make sense that the adversaries have this seeming hatred for proper creation of life, as abominations only formed from half of the creative potential energy of the universe. The creation of true life would seem a great sustenance to them. It is something they ultimately lack. So, children, as the most pure and innocent form of this newly created life, would be the ultimate sacrifice. Now, of course, the sacrifice of children is also quite dark and insidious, but considering the fact that these ancient Near Eastern traditions usually sacrificed children in underground rituals, it is seemingly too much of a coincidence to ignore. We should also not ignore that certain Near Eastern religious traditions had quite the animosity for the ancestral Indo-European traditions that our forefathers in Europe, Iran, and northern India practiced. However, that is not to say that the gods of our ancestral traditions did not seemingly want to put an end to the gods of the Near Eastern traditions as well. For example, in early Babylonian mythology, we find references to the serpent goddess Tiamat, who is associated with creation, particularly the creation of monsters. It seems that in earlier myths, however, Tiamat was not necessarily an evil deity. Archaeological excavations in the ancient city of Nineveh in the mid-19th century uncovered an ancient Babylonian epic known as the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, there is a great battle between the gods, in which the goddess Tiamat turns into a monstrous serpentine dragon and starts spawning hordes of abominations. The gods, fearing for their position in the heavens, appeal to a relative newcomer in the scene of mythology, a deity by the name of Marduk. Marduk, using lightning bolts, slays Tiamat and her lover Kingu, and from the bodies of these two monsters creates the world. Now, while Marduk's Indo-European origins cannot be necessarily asserted, it is quite interesting that the earliest recorded version of the Enuma Elish originates from the time in which Babylon was ruled by the Kassites, an Indo-European class of nobility that ruled over a largely Semitic and Mesopotamian populace. If we look at the etymology of the name of Marduk, his name means in ancient Sumerian the solar calf, or the calf of the sun, in particular the bull calf of the sun. His name could also be interpreted as meaning that he is immortal or unconquerable. Interestingly, the ancient Hellenistic Greeks and the Romans later referred to Marduk as an equivalent of Zeus or Jupiter. Given what we know of this Marduk, it would not seem surprising that he was perhaps a later introduction to the Babylonian pantheon introduced by the Kassite Indo-Europeans to their subjects. He could thus be considered the indigenous Sumerian attempt to rationalize Dyēus, or perhaps Sol Invictus, as a native Babylonian deity. Whether or not Marduk has Indo-European origins, his story and his conflict with Tiamat certainly parallel the stories of the gods warring with the adversaries. The other important takeaway from this myth of the Kosmogonamachy is the introduction of the Hieros Gamos, the sacred union between the Earth Mother and the Sky Father. Clearly, this story shows the origin of this pairing and shows how, on a cosmological and on a biological level, the Sky Father fertilizes and impregnates the Earth Mother with life. In the traditions of the ancient Greeks, we know that the Sky Father Uranos plugged up the Earth Mother Gaia with his phallus, and in turn led to the creation of life within her. Gaia then tried to get her children to attack Uranos, and ultimately the god Kronos was successful by severing the genitals of his father. While in the Greek traditions, Uranos is not necessarily seen as an evil figure, he's clearly a far cry from the Sky Father that we know. I would imagine that Uranos is a de-evolution of the Sky Father figure, as in some ways Uranos, Kronos, and Zeus are Sky Fathers, although Zeus is the closest etymological comparison. In many ways, however, Uranos more closely resembles Dyēus Pater than Zeus does later on. The concept that the Sky Father took his wife from a former enemy of war is not without precedent in Indo-European traditions. In Norse traditions, some have argued that Frigg, the wife of the Aesir god Odin, is actually the Vanir goddess Freya, who, according to mythology, is married to a figure named Odur. Etymology aside, there is actually similar comparisons in terms of role between Freya and Frigg, as well as between Odur and Odin. While the Hieros Gamos manifests in many different forms throughout our Indo-European traditions, the most important takeaway from this myth is that the Hieros Gamos, the union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, provides for us a moral example of how the marital structure on Earth for us humans should be organized. Simply put, humans are primarily defined by one of the two primordial energies. They are either defined by masculine heat or feminine cold. These two energies can exist on their own, but any life created outside of them is ultimately abomination. Only by the proper pairing of both of these primordial energies in the divine coupling between humans of a man and a woman can we truly attempt to reach the divine and tap into the true creative potential of these primordial energies. This myth also reveals to us that, to an extent, sex is a sacred act, that the matching of these masculine heat and feminine cold energies should not be an effort undertaken lightly, for ultimately the creation of life is possible, and any life created without a true proper respect to the sacred union, the Hieros Gamos, is ultimately an affront to the gods themselves. This is not really a surprising new revelation, as we know that from Hindu tantric practice, sex is considered a sacred act as well. Finally, this myth explains the physical origins of the planet Earth that we live on. Any true pagan knows that science is not contrary to religion. In fact, science enhances religion by finding ways to physically affirm the realities of the universe. Quite interestingly, the order in which Dheghom and Dyēus creates the Earth somewhat reflects the supposed natural origination of our planet. Dheghom comes first and forms a ball of mud and rock, but ultimately nothing really lives on this rock. However, in time, the atmosphere is created. Dyēus Pater manifests around the Earth and fertilizes it with his rains. This allows for the creation of life on the planet. This pairing of the divine masculine heat and the divine feminine cold, the pairing of Sky Father and Earth Mother, is ultimately what allows life on this planet to exist. Alright, we've reached the end of today's episode of the Son of the North podcast, but before I leave you, I want to quickly answer a few viewer questions that I was asked over on my Instagram page. We'll start with this first question. Which genetic traits do you think are necessary to be considered part of the tribe and possess the same collective unconscious? I think this is a backwards way of looking at the idea of tribes. It's not necessarily that a particular genetic trait, for example blue eyes or blonde hair, defines one's membership to a tribe. Rather, a tribe is defined by a shared genetic inheritance, the same ancestors. I believe in the concept of neo-tribalism. If you and your devoted friends and close followers go out and form your own tribe, it doesn't matter that you don't necessarily have the same genetic traits, as in time, your genes will be merged together in your tribal gene pool. This is what forms the foundation of tribe, and it is from this that the collective tribal unconscious forms. For inheritors of the Indo-European solar bloodline, you should not worry so much if members of your tribe originate from one branch of the Indo-European family or the other. For example, if you are a German and your partner is a Slav or perhaps an Iranian, it doesn't really matter what these past identities are, because you are in the process of creating a new tribal identity, a new culture, and a new genetic base from which our Indo-European traditions can spread and branch off. I think that sufficiently expresses my thoughts on that question, so let's move on to the next question. Question 2 asks, do you lift, and if so, are you an absolute unit? Yes, as a matter of fact, I do lift, but that being said, at my current physical state, I am not entirely happy with the physique I have, so I'm working towards a larger goal. That being said, I think too many people get caught down in the idea of trying to be as big as possible. Surely our ancestors were very strong, and much stronger than the average human today, but they weren't entirely muscle. They had a much more balanced physique. They had strong hearts as well as strong muscles. They needed to be able to run and achieve a number of great things on the steppe. I do enjoy lifting, and as a Kshatriya who is denied the righteous element of the battlefield, I personally find the gym a perfect escape for venting my frustrations and expressing my true warrior spirit. That being said, I am also a big believer in the idea that one should not only go to the gym, but try and find a balance in life and work where your work is a physically demanding act. Surely some Indo-European traditions had gyms, the Greeks and the Romans being the most famous examples, but for the most part, our ancestors were physically strong and had great physiques because they lived physically demanding lives. My good friends over at the Oathblood tribe have recently introduced me to the concept of stone lifting, which is a very common tradition among the ancient Celts as well as the Anglo-Saxons, and I've been trying to get into this recently. I've found a few good boulders that I can lift up, but for the most part, given the geological region I'm in, we don't find so many large rocks as we do kind of thin sheets of sedimentary rock. So I'm going to have to keep looking, and once I find a good stone, I'm going to have to take it home. For today's final question, what do you do professionally other than leading a pagan rebellion? I don't think rebellion is the term I would use, but clearly some people haven't listened to the first episode of the podcast, but that's all right. Professionally, I am what we would refer to as an archaeological consultant. Essentially, when certain industries or companies seek to develop an area, they contact archaeological consultants to perform archaeological surveys and, if necessary, excavations in an area, so that the company doing the development can meet with provincial or federal government standards for the preservation of human cultural heritage. Alright, this episode has reached the 1 hour mark, so I think we're going to end it off here for today. But I hope you've enjoyed listening to today's episode of Son of the North. My friends, I am honored to have served as your temporary escape from the soul-crushing insanity of the Kali Yuga. May the gods bless you and your loved ones in the days to come. This is Rex, signing off.